From viruses that are techno-organic to whether Mother Ascani should be a source of panic, Marvel Snap players are passionate about a lot of things, but one thing they're more passionate about than anything else is yelling at people on the internet. This is Marvel Snap Hot Takes. TOV nerf was too harsh. I get that they did it because meta share of the card was too big and it was a pretty easy deck to pilot and do well with in lower elos, but I fear the deck lost its identity of here are my big guys with negative effects, let me get rid of their text. I think that this is wrapping up a couple of assumptions in its premise that I don't necessarily agree with, which is, first, it's saying that the TOV nerf was too harsh. I'm not even sure how many people would agree with you that it was a nerf. I personally think it is a nerf. It is taking the card out of decks that are very good at adapting and heavy tech and putting it more into a combo space where you're running a lot of engine pieces in order for the TOV deck to actually make sense. So you're playing a lot of things that are built to synergize, not just with TOV, but also with Quinjet. And so when you are playing these like engine heavy decks, you lose to other engine heavy decks like Zombie Galacti, decks like the Captain Carter combo deck. You have like occasionally some interaction for them, but generally when you're just doing points, you better be the best thing that's doing points. And TOV, I think, is very good at beating up on mid-range piles because it is secretly kind of a combo deck now. But largely what I'm saying is I think it was a nerf in terms of I think maybe I had a higher level of respect for the TOV deck than a lot of other like high-level players did, because I thought it was very much up there with the best decks in the game, and if not the best deck of the game at a high level, it was just a very solid, powerful thing to be doing. And I think that people portraying this as like oh, they nerfed it because it was good at lower levels. Like, no, it was really good at high levels too. It was just a really, really good deck that was doing really, really strong things in a package that allowed it to be the metagame police with a bunch of tech in it. And so I think that TOV, first of all, did get nerfed, but not by a massive amount. Maybe you could argue the output is higher now because it's more of a combo deck. It's at least still a deck that's around and I would argue quite good, but it's quite good in a way that is much less harmful to the metagame. It's quite good in a way that isn't running 7 tech cards. It's quite good in a way that is much closer to a deck that people can adapt to and try to beat with various tech cards of their own or with strategies that go over the top of it. And that is a very good space for a deck to end up in. So I don't think TOV was over nerfed. I think it was nerfed appropriately to divorce it from being a card that supplemented tech cards. This is a deck that was able to get most of its power from a very cheap, repeatable effect, which allowed it to play a bunch of tech cards with bodies that limited what other things could exist in the metagame. And I think that getting that out of there means that the nerf was not only deserved, and the fact that the deck still seems powerful in a totally different, more combo-oriented form means that I do think it was nerfed, but I don't think it was nearly nerfed too much. Cosmo is OP and needs a counter, something similar to Deafening Chord's effect, but an activate. I mean, I don't think that would be a very good counter to Cosmo. Cosmo is typically the kind of card that's meant to show up and do what it does later in the game, like lock down things. I have thought that Cosmo was at least a little bit problematic on and off for like 4 years now, basically. He's just a little bit too wide-ranging, but that's not the same thing as being busted. Like, I think when people talk about these cards, they talk about it only in terms of power. I don't think Cosmo is overpowered. I think too much is wrapped up in him. I think he has a portfolio that is too wide. But whether or not that results in him being overpowered is dependent on the rest of the meta. And when he fits into situations where a lot of what he does is, I think, unhealthy, I would have a lot less of a problem with Cosmo if Cosmo were a card that stopped Wong from happening. In fact, when the versions of Star-Lord were running around, I think that was maybe one of the first times ever that Cosmo has been just like actively the good guy. In as much as there's a problem with Cosmo, it's that he very often serves not as a thing that prevents your opponent from doing something stupid, but as a thing that prevents you trying to interact with your opponent from happening. a card that stops your Shang-Chi, a card that stops your Shadow King, a card that stops the interaction that allows a matchup to actually occur on the board, a card that goes in decks to prevent a sandcastle from being kicked down, when I think a lot of the most problematic things in Marvel Snap come from unkickable sandcastles. I think Star-Lord's a great example of this. Star-Lord, of course, had the big brother of Cosmo, that being Alioth, who's a card that I am pretty adamant has never actually made a Marvel Snap metagame more fun, more enjoyable, or better. I can't think of a single time where Alioth was meaningfully addressing something that would otherwise be terrorizing the metagame. It has only ever showed up in order to make sure that your interaction doesn't affect the thing terrorizing the metagame. And in as much as I have a problem with Cosmo, it's because it tends to play a similar role. But I have seen Cosmo do good things for the metagame recently. Shout out to what it was able to do in the Star-Lord meta. If he didn't exist, that would have been a really much larger problem than it otherwise was. And I think that having seen Cosmo do something that is at least decent, I'm willing to give him a little bit of a chance. I also think that it's not necessarily all that bad if a card is a little bit good at doing this. The problem is largely, how long are we okay with this? And I think that Cosmo going to 3-2 would not affect him too much, but it could. And that could be a bad thing too, because it's not like you want only interactive tools to be the successful things. Cosmo rides a balance. There are definitely metagames where he is overpowered, and in as much as he is overpowered, it is because his job is to stop interaction. I don't think that they need to release a tech card for him, largely because I don't think said tech card would work. Like, I gotta play this card in the Cosmo lane and then activate it in order for my things to happen, and it's like, they know that that's happening, so there's no cube equity in this, but there's still tons of cube equity in Cosmoing on 6, and I don't really buy the shape that has been constructed here. But I do think that, you know, Cosmo is definitely a reasonable card to complain about, even though I think much of the player base considers him innocuous. Mr. Negative should be a 3, -2. I mean, I kind of think this would be cool, but Mr. Negative is one of those cards where it's like, I don't even know how much that would do. I don't think Mr. Negative's problem is that Mr. Negative, when you play the card Mr. Negative, is not good enough. Mr. Negative is a deck whose problem is that when you don't play the card Mr. Negative, you don't do anything. And when you do play the card Mr. Negative, you lose to Mobius. And so, like, I kind of think that it's pretty safe to do a lot of stuff to Mr. Negative. Like, I'm not saying this would be a problem balance-wise. Again, I talked about with Cosmo, where people talk about whether this would be OP as if that's the only reason to make or not make a decision along these lines, and I don't think that's true. I think there are plenty of other reasons to make decisions that are related to balance, some related to ubiquity, some related to fun. And in this case, my question would be, are we sure that's making people have more fun? Do we think that that's actually something that's adding to the game? What percentage of the metagame being Mr. Negative decks would you consider to be healthy? And I think that those questions are the ones that people rarely ask. Like, if I had to guess, and I don't want to be rude or anything, but to me, this feels like someone who was like, Mr. Negative isn't that good. What if we made Mr. Negative better? And like, that's a totally valid line of thought. But is it good to make Mr. Negative better? How much would this make Mr. Negative better? Do you think that that could make the game feel a little bit imbalanced or bad in any way? Whether a change, one of the things that happens a lot when we talk about balance is my viewers tend to think of things in terms of whether a change would be safe to do, whether it would be okay, whether it wouldn't be busted or not, and not whether it would be fun to do, whether it would be a good thing for more of this thing to happen, right? And that's normal because I think Marvel Snap, even as much as I doubt the amount of identity it's created, there are certainly people out there who are like, I'm a Mr. Negative gamer, I'm a discard gamer, I'm a destroy gamer. That's awesome, and it's glad that they're wedded to that identity, but it causes them to see, you know, a buff to the thing that they like as something that is sort of like an inherent good and not like, oh, are we sure this is actually healthy? Are we sure this is good? And that's sort of how I feel this question comes across, where it's like someone who wants to make Mr. Negative stronger, who's like, I figured out a way to make Mr. Negative stronger. But that's not actually the problem, I think, right? Like, is Mr. Negative at this cost providing a more compelling gameplay experience? Or is it just saying that you win a little bit more when you play him? And you get to snap a little bit earlier and you don't have to run, you know, Psylocke anymore. Is that an upgrade? Is that like, is making the Mr. Negative deck better in the ways that this would make the Mr. Negative deck better something that's worth doing? And for what it's worth, like, I don't think it would be bad for them to do this, but I also, like, I'm not convinced it would be good. This game has been a wild success. A small dev team built a zero fluff gameplay loop that respects your time better than most TCGs on the market. Commercially, it has been a triumph. It is not flawless, but we can't call this anything other than a huge win for a small studio. I am tempted to agree with many of the premises here, but I think what you can also call it is maybe a bit of a fumble, right? I think Marvel Snap is one of the greatest games I've ever played. I don't know how many people have played Marvel Snap and bounced off of it, but I would imagine that the gameplay part of Marvel Snap is actually as good as I think it is, and I believe that. The problem is they revolutionized card game gameplay and then also tried to revolutionize card game acquisition. And some of that is in the service of the gameplay. We want 12 cards. Okay, we can't make that many cards. How do we do card acquisition when we can't make that many cards? That's a valid question to ask. Like, we've seen other games struggle with this as well. It's not like this is the only vertical card battler on the market. We've seen Pokemon, the TCG that you play, Pokemon Pocket, struggle with, like, how do we actually monetize this? And how do we make it feel like you aren't just opening a million duplicates all the time? How do we structure this? How many sets do we release? How often are we going to be releasing sets? Does that burn people out, right? And Pokemon, that said, is a bit of a cheat code of an IP. They can kind of do whatever they want. But I do think there are reasonable lessons to take from this, which is that, like, I think Marvel Snap might have been better off with a monetization model that was more like Pokemon, where it was just like, yeah, you're going to open packs, you're going to open dupes, and you're going to deal with it. Like, you're just going to actually deal with it, right? Instead, what they did was they offloaded a lot of the weight of carrying the monetization onto individual cards, which is bad for internet discourse, because what it does is it means people come in and they say, a card costs $60? And it's like, well, yes, but that same card is also free. So what does it actually cost? Up to you. And so it only ever gets framed in these, like, very harsh terms, because, like, if you pay the money for the tokens for the card, it's $60. But if you play the game, it's $0. And so, like, what they did but was create a model that can't be discussed in any kind of meaningful way, because it's so personalized to your own individual things that the only fair thing to do when discussing it is to discuss it in the extremes and say cards are $60 in this game. And that's really harmful to a game. That's a really bad thing. And so I think that one of the things that they did when making this game, like, yeah, it's a wild runaway success. It's a great game. But they tied their incredible revolutionization of card games to an economy that I don't think has ever really worked in the way that you'd want. And I think that a lot of, like, people that bounce off of Marvel Snap, it's because of that. It's because of the discussions around that. It's because of things like Kid Omega. It's because of all of these various things that, to me, are all down to the core decisions on the gameplay level. And, you know, the core decisions on the gameplay level do affect the economy. If you're going to have 12 cards per deck, every card that you sell is going to have to carry a greater weight. And while I think there were things that they could have done, I do think that in some ways the gameplay put this pressure on the monetization. And then, of course, the monetization took it and ran with it, but that's beside the point. Tournaments and Golden Gauntlets are amazing, but people have got to stop reading into the results. Matchups are arbitrary, the breaker system is arbitrary, and player skill is involved, don't get me wrong, but past a certain threshold, Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that is tough about, or has been tough for me about being good at card games, is I remember when I wasn't good at card games, and I would read into the results of these tournaments in ways that now to me seem laughable, and I would think about things in ways that now to me seem laughable and sort of obviously incorrect. But if you had told me all the things that I know now and told me they were mistakes, I probably wouldn't have believed you. And I think that that's a pretty tough thing about the space I exist in, or at least it's something that I've struggled with, where I think that a lot of how do I find the best deck, a lot of discussions around that are filled with people who wouldn't know the best deck if it hit them in the head. And I think that that is something that is really tough to exist in the midst of, right? And this is not just about tournaments, it's about, like, stat sites and everything. There are a bunch of contextual things where I think, you know, you look at Unhelpful Yoda winning the tournament, he's a great player. I talked to him about his run. I was like, hey man, I think you were pretty unfavored the entire way through. Great run. He was like, yeah, I also thought I was pretty unfavored basically every matchup past the top 16. So my top 8 matchup, my top 4 matchup, my top 2 matchup, I thought I was on the losing end of all those matchups if you played them out 100 times. But they didn't. They played him out one time and he did great. And I think that understanding that is kind of key to this, where it's like the guy that won the tournament might not have had the best deck for the tournament. He might have played well. He might have gotten lucky. A bunch of things might have happened. And Unhelpful Yoda, I think, had a great deck, but he was definitely, like, prior to the top 16, probably not favored to win the tournament. People act like these things are inevitable after they've happened, but they're not. They're extremely evitable. And I think that stuff like that, like understanding, you can show up and do your best and get everything right and still get your ass kicked. You can absolutely do that. That's entirely possible. You can show up and do everything wrong and still win a tournament. Also possible. Maybe not everything, but enough things. And I think people don't like hearing that or believing that, right? But this is a game that has a meaningful amount of variance, and really large numbers are kind of the only things that can get to it. But even when it comes to stats, I think people rely on them too much as explicative, as like, this explains why this is how it is. And it's like, I don't even think that stuff's true. And so I think a lot of discussion in the community around this stuff is not necessarily rigorous in the way that I would like it to be. And I try. Like, there's a reason, like, when I do my best decks videos, what I talk about isn't so much the decks, but how they fit into a metagame context. And even those, it's like, sometimes I'm like, is this the right name for this? Like, is this actually a tier list, or is this me just saying, here's what the meta is, and here are the dynamics that inform it, right? Like, I don't really know. I definitely try to take a lens where it's like, these are the things that I think about this metagame. You can trust me or not, if you think that, but like, you can take it or leave it. It's whatever. But here's why I think it. Here are the dynamics that inform this thought process. Here's why I think X deck or Y deck is good or bad. And if you look at my lists and you look at a data-driven tier list, they're going to look very different. And if you look at my list and you look at the tournament top 8, they're going to look very different, right? I think I'm right, even in the face of that. Mother Ascani didn't need a nerf. SD nerfed her to quiet the loud critics. The -1 power does nothing about what actually makes her bursty, and the stats agree. Win rate unchanged post OTA. It's actually up so far, 49 to 54, 50.4, small sample. So this is kind of a great example of like the stats thing that I really don't like, right? Because it gives you some numbers, which make the argument sound a lot stronger, but the argument doesn't actually rely on numbers, and it implies only one possible reason that those numbers could change, when there are a bunch of reasons those numbers could change. Here's a counter thesis for you. Not that the nerf didn't do anything and actually made her stronger, but that instead she was being overplayed. The nerf got her out of decks she didn't belong in, and her win rate went up because now people are playing her only in decks where she's supposed to go. Or alternative hypothesis, a bunch of bad players thought the nerf was a meaningful thing, and a bunch of good players recognized that it wasn't. So now the sample is diluted, or not diluted, or split, such that the only people playing her are the people who are a little bit better at the game, and they can already recognize that thing. There's a million different explanations for all of this stuff, and that's one of the most frustrating things about dealing with stat sites. And I know this is the Snap Complete guy. I don't want to dunk on him specifically, so I'm going to name some other names, right? You go on to Untapped, and a number appears next to a deck that says 55% win rate. And then you look at another deck that has the same exact cards except one changed, and it says 47% win rate. Why is that? Almost certainly the answer is that the truth is somewhere in the middle, and one change doesn't actually make that big of a difference in win rate, but it's actually like someone booster farming in the sample size or whatever. You know what I mean? But these numbers are presented separate from each other. It's just the 55% is going to sit at the top, and then you won't see the 47 until you scroll down. And there's no like variance in there. Like, okay, here is our 55% win rate thing. What does that mean with this sample size? What's the variance on that? Is it plus or minus 2.5%? What would you describe as the variance on that? Is there any like regression being done on statistical significance? Like the comment here where he's talking about, 50.4 small sample. It's like, well, if you know it's a small sample, why are you telling me the numbers, right? Like I think that anyone running these knows that it's really hard to draw accurate conclusions from data because they're educated in data science on some level, right? They know this, but every UI is still set up such that like these are the premises are the conclusions almost, where it's like the win rate change should be a bullet point. It shouldn't be explicative. It shouldn't be, this is proof of something. It should be, oh, I've noticed this. What are some possible reasons that it could have occurred? And then the thing that I actually want to talk about with this one that I think is like notable is if you reread the beginning where it says, SD nerfed her to quiet the loud critics, and the -1 power does nothing about what makes her bursty. Okay, what if I presented a contrapositive, which is that Mother Ascani was being played in a million different decks? And I know this because I checked Untapped, and the play rate on Mother Ascani was like 30%, right? Anyway, I'll stop being snarky about this, but like, a card being played a bunch is a good reason to nerf it. And more than that, it's a good reason to nerf it in the way that they did, which left most of the core of it intact and took away a little bit of incentive to put it in decks that it probably, maybe, didn't belong in, which actually would result in the win rate going up because now more people are playing in the decks that it's good in instead of the decks that it's bad in. But it's such a good card that even in decks where it was bad, it was showing up. And like, again, I'm not saying this is what happened, but I am confronted by someone who is saying, this is what happened. Here are the numbers that prove it. And I don't know, man. I think it depends. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal. I'll see you in the next one.